if you feel uncomfortable, feel free to turn your camera off with the recording. And it's great to see you this time, Linda. I don't know what's going on over there. We can actually see Linda today.
Oh, you're talking about me?
Linda Cummins, yeah, we're talking about you.
All right.
Let's see here. Share. Oh. All right, so we always start off, and I switched the order of the agenda to have Tom close us, because since Madeleine's work, she was going to check in with some colleagues to see what was the newest and latest. Her article was from September, and since Tom was doing the update, I went ahead and switched them so that he can fill us in on any shifts, and that looks like it's a good idea. So these are our group agreements, and so as we go through, we're going to popcorn these out today. If everybody can just take one and go through and let us know if there's anything that is, if there is anything that is missing for you that you need to feel safe in this space, we can definitely add it. And if there's anything here that you have a question about, you can let us know. So I'll go ahead and start. It's okay to respectfully disagree. It is not okay to blame, shame yourself or others.
Be aware of intent and impact.
Practice self. Go ahead. I'm not sure who that was.
No, go ahead, Fiona.
Okay. Practice self-care, take breaks when needed, and try to come back to the discussion.
Practice both and thinking.
Maintain confidentiality.
Notice your process and your content. Don't manipulate the situation.
Lean into discomfort and take risks. Try on a new idea.
Approach this work with a beginner's mind.
And mind your blind spots. So those are the agreements. Is there anything that anybody else needs to feel safe or supported in this space right now? All right. And then also the mission statement of the racial justice group. I said Pride team. This is not the Pride team. The racial justice group. We landed on Glide's racial justice group educates and seeks liberation for the oppressed and marginalized, with emphasis on BIPOC, in order to realize the beloved community we are called to be, which we just landed on that last week. So we'll let that marinate. We had some question about the we are called to be at the end. So let that marinate and we'll check back in at the end. All right, so where we landed at the end of last meeting was that we finished the podcast, or some of us did. I wanted to check in to see if anybody got a chance to go back to the podcast and if there is any new information that folks found compelling that they wanted to quickly go over, or the Next to Six process that we were planning on embarking on.
I finished up. I'd only listened to one episode and I finished it up on I think yesterday was the last one. I just think overall it struck me that, I don't know if simple's right, but straightforward, the straightforward act of just sitting their asses in meeting, you know, the Austin example really stuck with me. Of just like they just set themselves in the meeting and were willing to take a little bit of discomfort with, you know, the folks who wanted them to not be there, but how much that changed.
And just to be clear, the podcast we're discussing is the untold story of policing, which goes into a lot about police union agreements and what's not going right collectively across the United States with regards to how much power is placed there and what we can do to dismantle some of those systems. Was there anybody else?
Fiona, I really enjoyed listening to it. I hadn't listened to it all last time, and I listened to it all the way through, and I think I listened almost the whole thing again through, and I feel like I'll go back, and sometimes it takes me a little while to absorb stuff.
I've already listened to it 3 times, Fiona, so don't
Yeah.
feel self-conscious about that.
I'll keep doing that. Yeah, and there was some great stuff in there. Yeah, I like this idea of, well, I'm not going to be able to recall the details. It's just that I loved what they laid out, and it feels like there are things we could do. So I'm excited for us to dive into that if possible.
Okay. Is there anyone else? Linda, you keep throwing me off with this, Alan.
Yeah, I was very, I listened to it again, just very inspired by it. I love what they did in Austin. And I'm anxious to hear from Madeleine, because in her article, or in your article, Madeleine talked about these long meetings and hours worth of public comment. And it, made me think, gosh, we have a lot of work cut out for us. And it's not going to be an easy road, and we're committed. But I'm looking forward to hearing Madeleine speak to her experience and what advice, Madeleine, you might have for us as we try to do our Nix the Six.
All right. So let's dive in. It sounds like we're ready to talk to Madeleine, if that's okay. So our guest speaker, Madeleine, was a hoot and a ride. I love talking with her for our brief little check-in on Monday. She is a student activist, an organizer, and a journalist. And I don't know if she accepts all of those roles fully, but that's what I see. And I also want to shout out Urban School and Wesleyan University, where she is currently a student. And she's an undergraduate research fellow who's receiving the support from the study of public life through the Davenport Study Grant, and to contact ethnographic research on homelessness services in San Francisco. And she's doing this with the support of Wesleyan's anthropology department, the Coalition of Homelessness and Activists, and academic advocates. And Madeleine also spends her time studying the way that grief shapes the effective experience of social service providers, which is so interesting. I would love to dive into that if we have time. And Madeleine is also an intern at the SF Coalition on Homelessness, where her roles include having organized a major action for Black unhoused lives, as well as covering policing and homelessness for the Street Sheet, which is where she grabbed our attention. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and we can dive in with Madeleine. So Madeleine, if you could just start us off and talking to us a little bit about how you came to this work, and how you connected with the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness, and where you see your work going, and then we'll open it up to the floor so that they can ask questions.
Yeah, totally. I'm really excited to be here with you all. I was born and raised in San Francisco. My mom worked for the city government for most of my life, and she actually died when I was 15, and that really changed. It was at a time when I was learning a lot about sort of who I wanted to be politically. The Urban School where I went to high school has a really rigorous identity and ethnic studies program. And through it, I was learning to sort of think about whiteness and wealth and all of these categories in my life that had been previously unmarked. And thinking about sort of what they meant for San Francisco, a city I loved, but that I saw changing, and that I knew was always going to have space for me, but likely wasn't going to have space for a lot of the people that like made it the place I wanted to be. So my best friend was evicted, and her like family lost their home. And I like watched sort of the city change really radically to feel at the end sort of like a playground for tech geeks in some ways, which is maybe too harsh, and I think there are still things that are really beautiful about the city. But I'm really interested in, as Paula said about my project, the intersection of grief and activism, and the way that grief can be something that's really hard and isolating, but can also be something that like is really beautiful and can create solidarity that really has depth. Not exactly what I'm here to talk about, but I just wanted, I know that can be tenuous, so I wanted to tell you all a little bit about that. I was also really interested in the way that narratives around homelessness get created. I'm an English major as well as an anthropology major. And so I was really interested in the coalition's work because they are super outspoken against city and state policy in a way that many other organizations can't be, because they take a lot of city and state money. So the coalition is totally like funded based on private and foundation donations, which means that they have a lot of latitude to shit on the city when they're not happy with the decisions that they've made, which they use liberally. So I poked around and found someone who knew someone else, and I ended up on the phone with someone and said, I'm doing this project. I would love to come work for you all while I'm doing it. And that's what I did. And it was great. It was sort of a mess because of COVID. And because a lot of the people that the coalition work with don't have any access to phones or any technology, and we're in some ways, one of the hardest situations they've ever been in their lives, even though they were living on the street. Like, COVID really upended every single thing that an unhoused person would do in their day, from sitting on the bus to being in a coffee shop to, you know, maybe crashing on a friend's couch. So it was definitely a really intense time, but it was also really great. And I feel like I learned a ton. Yeah, I don't know exactly what else to say about me and my path. I love to write, and I'm hoping to do that more. I love San Francisco, and I really believe in San Francisco as a place where there's a lot of will to change things. And I think that's true in a lot of places, but I think those of us that are based in San Francisco are lucky that we can see that in all sorts of ways. So yes, my policing article is in some ways a downer, because people like Chesa Boudin, who at least I was so excited to see elected, have not necessarily been the deliverance that we were hoping for in terms of policing. That's a complicated one. He's done some great things too. But I see this issue as really complicated and as really hard even for leftists in city government to change, for reasons that I sort of laid out in the article, because a lot of people argue that for reforms to happen, you need more money. There are a lot of ways that policing happens, especially for heavily marginalized people like unhoused people that have nothing to do with police. Even though you can call 311 to say that someone's sleeping on your sidewalk, and that's better than calling 911, like, you're still going to get someone who comes and tells that person to move. And even though that is not an arrest, like, that type of policing of public spaces and the privileging of people in houses over people who are living on the sidewalk, like, is a form of violence, and taking people's tents is a form of violence. And like, all of these ways in which folks on the street are like made precarious more than they already are, like, is policing, even if it's not done by police. So I don't know if you guys have seen sort of all of the infographics that are like, we should have social workers and not police. And like, yes, we should, but also those social workers can go and reinforce the same systems that police would. And it's way better that they don't have guns, right? And it's way better theoretically that they have mental health care. But if the expectation from elected officials and from people in houses is that they will move the person sleeping on the sidewalk, like, there's still a lot of violence being committed. So I'm gonna leave it at that. My article had a lot more about San Francisco specificities. I know you might want to hear a little bit about sort of what I think of London Breed's sort of rollout of her plan, and I have some thoughts, but I would just like love to hear any questions.
I would like to hear what you think about her, if you don't mind.
I think she's a complicated political figure. I think she has been pretty police friendly over the course of her tenure in everything but sort of rhetoric. Like, she has said some great things, but we haven't seen policing really change under her. And I think that, like, in the time since she has said that police aren't going to be responding to nonviolent unhoused people, we have watched police respond to nonviolent unhoused people. So it's great that she's saying these things. However, it doesn't really matter if change isn't being made. And I published one other Street Sheet article this summer, and it was about London Breed's texts to the chief of police about homeless people that she was seeing around the city. And she like hates homeless people. Like, she's like, I'm eating my lunch and I see a homeless person, like, send a cop out here to deal with them. And that's just like horrible and really sad that that's the person that's like leading us through this. I also, I think, struggle to understand how her background and her personal history has led her to the stance that she often takes with policing, which is she's very in line with Chief Scott. around the idea of sort of reform and budget increase in order to support reform, rather than really looking at structural change. So I think I was reading a bit today just to brush up a little bit about these different commissions, and I think they all sound really great. I think the question is, for the people that are the most vulnerable, does it feel like it makes a difference? And the answer to that is on the thing that she rolled out, I think in like June, with when she said that police weren't going to be responding to nonviolent unhoused people, like it didn't make a difference. Like I haven't talked to a single person that was like, yes, since that happened, we haven't experienced the X thing. And actually, even though the CDC declared that sort of sweeps shouldn't be happening, people shouldn't be forced to move their tents in the middle of COVID, like the whole time during shelter in place, there have been sweeps, and there have been people forced to move. And often those people were offered alternatives, but often the alternative was like a big congregate shelter in which they would share a room with 5 other people, and people like don't want that, and they don't have to want that. Like I wouldn't want that right now. If the alternative was a tent, I would take that too. So a convoluted answer to say it's hard to tell from what she's saying what the impact is going to be. And historically it has been not good, especially as it relates to visible poverty.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go for it.
It sounds like the Board of Supervisors is doing a relatively good job of pushing her to, in the whole defunding the police, the reallocation of police funds. And that she's, wants to do this little percentage, but the Board of Supes wants to do more. And I saw in your article that that you think that it just isn't enough. And I think we agree with that. That if you have fewer police and the funds are allocated in different ways, that doesn't necessarily and probably doesn't lead to behavior change on the part of the police or to the change in the policing culture. And I noticed that you said that you believe in abolition, and I'm wondering what would that look like? Sounds cool.
Well, I'm gonna sort of reference Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who said that abolition's not that hard to imagine because it looks like a white suburban neighborhood, right? Where when a kid has drunk too much and is passed out vomiting, like an ambulance gets called, or when someone's having a mental health crisis, like you call their parent or a friend of theirs. Like there are places in the US, lots of places populated by lots of rich white people that don't live under the constant threat of police violence. Like I don't live my life under the constant threat of police violence. And so I don't actually think it's that hard to imagine. Like I can't think of an experience I would have that would either end with policing, honestly. Like I think I could steal something from a store and I doubt I would get arrested by the police. And I also can't think of a situation that I've been in my life that would be made better by policing. So I think the question is, like, if you can imagine that for yourself, right? Imagine that there isn't a situation that you've ever found yourself in necessarily where you as an individual would have fared better if there was police involvement. Then I think you can sort of imagine it for other people. And it gets complicated. Like Ayelet Waldman published a piece recently in the Atlantic about having someone break into her home in Berkeley and try to assault her, and how she ended up pressing charges for that person to be imprisoned, and how hard that was for her as an abolitionist, as a prison abolitionist. But so I'm not saying that there aren't stumbling blocks and moments. I think talking about sexual violence is a moment, especially for a lot of white women, that leads to serious pause with conversations about police abolition. I don't think these systems are keeping anyone safe. And I don't think that that there's any evidence that they do basically anything other than uphold like violent white supremacy. And for that reason, I think they can go and they must go. That's what I've got.
So it's not changing the culture. It's actually eradicating, and so you don't have a police force. You have civilians or other people that are taking care of public safety when needed? Or, I noticed that Paula suggested we looked at the recent press releases about what Mayor Breed has done, and just last Friday, she put together this new liaison unit, which apparently is going to be five police officers taking care of the whole city, which seems a little unrealistic, but dealing specifically with hate crimes. So neighborhoods that are, people of color and LGBTQ, and neighborhoods where a lot of people are non-English speaking, that this, it's a coalition. And so it sort of, I found it, I'd love to hear what anybody else thinks, but my initial response, especially after just reading about the budget cuts and we need to, that, okay, here we are, hello, this is adding, adding costs. This is adding to the budget. And it just seems like another Band-Aid that's really not going to do anything for anybody. What's your thought?
My thought is that it's in individual situations, it's hard to know. Like, will a community that has been conditioned to feel like they're a way that they can feel safer is to call the cops, feel safer that there's someone who speaks their language and maybe looks like them to help out? Maybe. And it's not on people who are violently marginalized to see an end to that system. It's on people who aren't, right? It's on people like me who aren't afraid at this moment in such a corporal way and such an embodied way to think about a world that looks different. So I also think that sometimes in these conversations, people point to members of marginalized groups that support policing as evidence that policing must be fine. And similarly, in this situation where there are these folks that are going to be liaisons, maybe the communities will really appreciate them. I don't fully know, but that doesn't mean that this system isn't profoundly broken. Even if there's a police call that goes great and the police comes and is super nice and de-escalates and does an awesome job, that's fine. That's great that happened. But the system is still completely broken. And that person probably didn't, it's probably luck, or that person's nice, who knows, but it doesn't mean necessarily anything about the system.
So it seems like anything to make it better is going to happen, as you just pointed out, on a lot of different levels. And one of the levels that I just read this article in the BBC, and you may know this Dr. Erwin Staub, S-T-A-U-B, Harvard, Stanford. He's a Holocaust survivor, and his area is the psychology of violence. And he's been doing this for decades. And this particular article is about being a Holocaust survivor. What he does is train heroic bystanders. That's one thing, an actual training program. And the other thing that I found so interesting that has been going on based on his work in New Orleans is with police departments, and the program is called, it's called Ethical Policing is Courageous. And it encourages officers to intervene if they see misconduct within their ranks. And the training in New Orleans that started in 2014 evidently has had amazing effects. So that, in other words, the culture is saying, it's a breaking that terrible blue culture, or whatever you call it, of protecting each other. But this is helping officers literally protect each other from getting in big trouble, because they're headed towards doing something that of course is terrible, but will also be terrible for them in terms of their own career, perhaps. I just thought both of those things were really interesting and another level in policing for consideration.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I just heard you talk about was sort of bystanders. And one thing that I helped start in my neighborhood was a signal thread, which is encrypted texting to to sort of track every time police were coming and interacting with unhoused people. And so every time someone saw, they're like, hey, I rode by the street on my bike and I saw a cop standing outside this tent and it didn't look like the interaction was quite right. Can someone go just like stand around and like watch and like see what happens?
Oh, that's really
And say, hey, like I'm a neighbor, I know this person who's camping here, like, is everything okay? Right? Like not a huge, not a physical altercation, not threatening anything, just sort of standing there saying like, I'm a housed person, I'm someone who's your constituent theoretically, and I'm gonna be here. The other thing that you talked about was sort of a change in police culture, and that's actually something that Chief Scott, who's San Francisco's police chief, talks a lot about. He talks a lot about what it would look like for SFPD to not be like just another racist police department, basically. And he said some unfortunate things. He said he banned bias in policing, which doesn't seem like it would maybe have any substance behind it. But he's also talking about like actual reform programs, right? Like things like what you're talking about. And my position is that is just making a fundamentally broken system a little less sort of egregiously unacceptable. And I think that in all of the violence that we saw this summer, like as a country, like we saw really clearly that even in cities like Minneapolis has instituted all sorts of anti-bias training, right? Like all of these cities in which things have gone horrifically wrong, there have often been programs, like cops have sat through diversity and inclusion trainings weeks before they've killed someone. And that isn't to say that maybe the number of people killed by that police department are way lower than the year before. And that is worth supporting and honestly celebrating, right? Like any life saved is massively important. And also it perpetuates this idea that we have to save policing, right? That like there's no world that will exist in which some version of like police as we know it doesn't exist. And so we have to figure out a way to reform it, and we have to figure out a way for it to look different. And I don't think that we do. And I actually think that pursuit can undermine the push for abolition.
We have a few new folks in the room. Matt Cahill and Tom Butler and Susanna have joined us. So we were just in conversation with Madeleine, if you had not picked up on it, about the article in the Street Sheet, and we've kind of gone over some of the things that she's uncovered, and now getting into what London Breed is doing and the police chief. So we'll open it up for any questions if you have some, and don't worry about repeating, because I think that creates understanding.
Well, I want to go back to a comment that you just made, Madeleine, because I find it really intriguing. So is the idea that law enforcement as it exists today is impossible to reform, and that the whole system just needs to be dismantled? Is that where you were going with that?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going with that. The framework is that something that came from slave patrols and has existed to reify white supremacy, to bust unions, to harass and kill queer and trans people for generations, and still does many of these things in different places, is not something that was built to keep people safe. It was actually built to do the opposite, which is to enact violence against certain people. I'm also going to put in the chat one of the things that I quoted in the article, which is this thing called Punishing the Poorest, and it's about policing in San Francisco directed at unhoused people. And it came out, I think, a couple years ago from the coalition. And it's got everything from sort of statistics on policing and unhoused people to sort of policy recommendations to sort of what individuals can do. And I think it's really useful.
Madeleine, is there any, let's not call it policing, but internationally, all the things you said are pretty obvious about why this culture doesn't support any kind of viable policing. does such a thing exist anywhere else? Like, we know in England they don't carry guns, as an example. Are there any systems that we could learn from? Replace what we have with.
I'm gonna, I think, have to tell you something that I told Paula when we talked on the phone, which is that I am in no way an expert on any of this. I'm 21 and I am a student and I care deeply about these questions, and I do not know about international policing at all.
Okay.
And I don't even, I know things about police abolition because of the work I've done, but I don't even know a ton about it. And I'm really excited to be here and to tell you guys about what I know, but it is very limited. And so I don't know. I think my understanding of structural racism is that it is very closely tied to capitalism, and that countries that have capitalist systems in which some people need to be poor in order for other people to be very rich often have massive levels of like heinous racism. And so countries that maybe that and there's really no country in the world that is not capitalist at this point in a serious way. And so I don't know. I would maybe guess not. I would say law enforcement in general often, like I know a bit about law enforcement in Mexico, and there's this protest in in Nigeria against SARS. Like law enforcement all over the world looks different, but it is often a tool of those in power to silence those without it. So
Well, I'd just like to go back to our, circle back to our one of the original things we talked about, and I see our time is moving along, is so we in wanting to take on this task of nixing the six, part of that is going to be attending meetings and being vocal at meetings. And Madeleine, you've been to lots of them, and I noticed in your article, again, you talked about the length of the meetings, and the thing that really struck me was that there was something in one of the meetings of the budget and allocations of the committee that there were like 400 different people that commented in the public comment, and so it's like, do you have, just based on the experience you have, do you have any little nuggets, any advice for us as to, how do you navigate, how do you make your way through that? I just like hang in there and keep going, or are there any tricks you've learned?
Yeah, this is actually something I'm super comfortable talking about. So some lawmakers are thrilled when 400 people show up to read basically the same script, because they're like, people care, and here is a lot of evidence that people care about this thing, and so here's what I'm going to do about it. Other lawmakers are like, this is a profound waste of my time, and I cannot believe I have to sit through 400 people saying the same thing. So it is complicated, right? It depends who you're trying to reach. I think generally having a call to your community in which you provide a partial script and say, here are the things we're asking for, and then ask them to insert something about their own experience, their own values, their own goals, right? Like, let's say defund SFPD was, I know you're in touch with people from DSA who do that organizing, and I was a bit involved with that too this summer. And the script is, we need to defund SFPD. And they'll leave like 45 seconds of the 2 minutes to be like, if you want to talk about anything you've experienced, like do that. And I think that is really effective. And so I think to blend both having a clear set of policy asks from lawmakers and like varying it and showing that it's not just people reading a script, it's people that really are sort of speaking from their own experiences, will generally be super effective. And I also think you can email your supervisors in San Francisco. I like heard back from like all of them. I had a question, and like their aides would email me, and then they would email me, and I was like, oh my God. So people are fairly accessible in local government, and I would try emailing folks and sort of seeing if you can get a meeting with a supervisor's aide to talk about what the supervisor is thinking or something like that to start.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, totally.
I do have a question before we transition over to Tom, about, I mean, we've kind of gone over all of the big things, the obstacles, the pitfalls, and what we know is that there needs to be a culture shift along with the dismantling. And when we think about corporate culture, when you're trying to shift that, that takes anywhere from 2 to 5 years. And so we're having these policies that are coming out, whether that be at the state and local level, or if that's at the national level, even with looking at what President Trump is rolling out, even as we speak. There is a lot of lip service that is put in there. And so what do we as a group expect as we're going along this path to see what our metrics for success are with regards to the things that we will eventually either collaborate with other groups with, or that we're putting forth? And what is our expectation around those cultural shifts?
Is that directed at me or at the group?
At the group. I mean, that's a reality. That's kind of a reality check, because as Linda said, as we're going down this road, and we have signed on to do this Nexus 6, and that means sitting in council meetings. That means putting in the time. Like right now, we're doing the education piece of this so that we can go in well equipped to do this work. And then when we actually start to do it, what tends to happen is it gets so overwhelming. Just even thinking about going up against the lobbyists. I was taking a walk today and I was like, well, if we did this, we would have to do this. And then we have to fight this lobby, and then we have to do this. And then it's just like all of these moving pieces that just even to think about it in a 15-minute walk today was exhausting mentally. And so where is our stamina as a group, and what is our commitment to this work?
I have a thought just with something that Madeleine shared about, you know, trying to reform the system might actually be reinforcing it. And I wonder, I mean, I just feel really inspired by what she shared with us today. And it's just, you know, making me think about things a little bit differently. You know, I think I've been thinking that abolition is maybe a bit too radical, but now I'm wondering if that's true. And so I wonder if there's some strategy we can take that might not get in the way of a good outcome, but might move us in that direction. Like maybe it's abolishing the police unions is a place to start, and then, you know, that there are, you know, steps we could take to maybe get toward a more completely new system.
And was
it was still overwhelming.
Was everybody able to check in on the defund SFPD now, which I had mentioned was a really radical, because they are just about abolished, and they have really concrete things that they are wishing for. I don't know if you were able to touch in on any of that research.
I didn't see that, Paula, but this is now just getting me to, I can't bite my tongue anymore, because I think it's very localized what we're talking about here in terms of like dismantle the police force. I'm so glad that there was a police force that was national to take down a militia in Michigan that tried to take out a governor. Like there's that shit that's happening in America right now, where we need law enforcement. Like there needs to be somebody to stop that kind of crazy from taking hold and growing. And, you know, it's not, so I think I think it has a lot to do with violence. This country is infatuated with violence. We call it, you know, different forms, but every Friday night, well, pre-pandemic, there was a local celebration of violence called high school football. And then on Saturday, a regional celebration that became national and exploiting Black kids and Black athletes. And then a national celebration of it beyond all of our imaginings when you get into the money that goes into the NFL. The very nature of that game, why people watch it, is inherently violent. And my point being, like, there's something distinctly American about violence and our infatuation with violence. that's intimately related to having a need for an enforcement of trying to manage that in society. And so I think I could get behind dismantling the police force if I thought that it wasn't deeper than that. Like there's problems that are deeper than just the enforcement mechanism of law. And that's all I got. Sorry.
Thanks, Matt.
So one thing, I used to live in San Francisco, but I live in Asheville, North Carolina now, which is a much, much smaller city. We've got about 80,000 people here. One of the things that we've done is work with the city council to actually send out a survey to all residents to ask what police should be involved in and what they shouldn't be involved in. And it was on a scale of like 1 to 5, like 1 never, 5 always, and then like in conjunction with other local community groups. And I realized that's not abolishing the police, which I do, Madeleine, like I hear you, and I'm like, yeah, this was a system that was not founded on good intent. But that was a way to start getting buy-in from, and I don't know, maybe that could happen on a neighborhood basis in San Francisco, or maybe that could, maybe it's something you could take to the city council to just get people's input on what does that look like. And Matthew, to your point, like where would there be situations where you felt like there was a need for police or for some type of enforcement?
Yeah, and I think on that note of what you just said, Lori, like one way to begin is to get to know one's neighbors, which is hard during COVID, and to ask them sort of what does it feel like for our neighborhood to be safe. And like under sort of the banner that a lot of communities of color have used, that's like we keep us safe. Like what does that mean? Right? Does it mean that someone's grandma can walk home at 11 p.m. from the grocery store and not be worried at all? Like what does that look like? And then how do we make that a reality? And I think that police abolition can be about taking on massive structures, and it can also be about what would it look like for us as a group of neighbors to not call the police and know that if this kid maybe has some issues, is like, like holding a knife, you call his mom and then you call his dad, and like what would it look like to do something else on a local sort of very like hyper small community basis. And Matt, I hear you. Something that I was thinking about while you were talking is like how many guns there are in America, and how there are more guns than people in the US right now, and how like we have a epidemic level gun violence problem that maybe we're not talking about right now because there's so much else going on, but it's still happening. And how in domestic violence situations, there's massive gun use, there's school shootings, like all of that is real, and abolishing the police wouldn't fix any of that. And unfortunately, the police are not that helpful in many of these situations. Like in domestic violence situations, in school shootings, like very few of them have been prevented. Very few school shootings have been prevented, even when there is a police officer with a gun on campus. Or in domestic violence situations, people often don't believe the women. And so what happened in Michigan, and what happens when law enforcement does their job and does it well, like, is important. And it's like reasonable to see that and be like, thank God someone stopped this horrible thing from happening. And also, by and large, on a daily basis, that's not what that system is doing. And so I think my question is, does the system that sort of tracks for, like, for example, like white supremacy and like groups, like militia groups in the US, need to have anything to do with the system that we have now? And for me, the answer is no. For me, the answer is that those skills don't actually overlap with what we ask of cops right now, and they don't actually and they don't need to. And so I think there can be a different mechanism to do that.
I want to honor our time. We're at 5. We've gone over, way over. But this has been very interesting. Tom, did you have any final words that you want, or should we roll you over to next
You can roll me over. What I have is, I mean, I can basically, I can say what I really have in about a minute and a half or less. There's a lot there in all those possible, whether it's board of supervisors, whether it's police commission, all that stuff is there, and it's there forever. I mean, it goes way back, and every one of those video things has an agenda. What's lovely about it is that if you know what you're looking for, the agenda's there, and you click on the agenda and it takes you to the spot in the video, you know, and there are hours and hours and hours and hours of meeting videos. So it would be very helpful to know what you want to find either ahead of time or historically. And then it would be huge. It would be super useful, but sort of just randomly trying to pick up information from it, I think that's going to be like a nightmare. So that's my Reader's Digest version of my research.
Who knew Tom had a Reader's Digest version for anything? I love it. That was a little dig, Tom. Sorry.
True, you're right.
So in our last 3 minutes, we'll wrap up. Are there any final thoughts for, where did Madeleine go? Did she roll off? Oh, there you are.
I'm here.
Any final thoughts for Madeleine? This has been a very rich discussion, and please do not discount your 21-year-old wisdom. It has been so wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I
Blessing.
As they say, we the older generation who have been subjected to these systems are learning from the younger generation what the possibilities are in dismantling them. And so I really appreciate the wisdom that you brought us tonight.
And Paula, may I just say that, Madeleine, you've been wonderful. And what, I don't know exactly how to make this happen, but it would be great for us to benefit from the wisdom that you gain as you continue to work with the coalition and continue to be part of, you know, what's going on in San Francisco. So we don't want to bug you, but it would be nice to figure out a way that we can continue to learn from you. So
I would love that. I will totally stay in touch with Paula, and I have some ideas from some other people that you guys might all want to hear from. There are a lot of people in San Francisco doing interesting work on this. There's an unhoused journalist who I think is pretty amazing, who I think would love to talk to you all. I'm going to reach out to, but yes.
Keep on doing what you're doing, Madeleine.
Excellent. And
Keep on doing what you're doing.
I will.
Are you on track for a spring graduation?
I am.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Well,
Yeah,
if there's nothing else, we are at 6 o'clock, so we'll say goodnight, and then I will send out the recording from this video and upload the links, and then also Madeleine has given me a short list that we can get started with some other journalists to take a look at. I did speak with Defund SFPD now, and they are actively working with the police union contract, and so they asked if they can maybe come in November or December instead, but they're excited to come and tell us what they're doing and to answer our questions there.
Good.
All right. Thank you so much for having me once again.
Thanks,
Bye, everyone.
Madeleine.
Bye.
bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Paula.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Good to see everyone.
Paula.
Good to